Hey everyone, welcome back to another Pathfinder Friday. We're back talking about the tail end of Age of Ashes Adventure Path. I'm James Jacobs, I'm the creative director, and...
Hi, I'm Luis Loza. I'm a developer for the Pathfinder Lostomens line.
And...
Also, author of Volume 6 of Age of Ashes, Broken Promises, according to what it says here on the front of the cover.
It's not a typo, I checked. So to start right out, there's going to be spoilers. So if you are playing in the Age of Ashes Adventure Path, remember that player knowledge and character knowledge are different things, or maybe turn off now. No, you don't want to turn off because there's going to be some fun stuff. Anyway, spoilers. And speaking of spoilers, one of the trickiest things about this adventure, I knew all from the very start that I wanted to do an adventure path about the Gold Dragon Mccurry, who's a really complicated character in the setting because he's running this sort of human farm.
Yes.
And that's kind of, not a good guy thing. Is it evil? It depends who you ask. I kind of think it is, because it's like if you're in charge and you're the one running a place and you say you and you are married, that's not good. That's kind of gross.
That is pretty gross. And it's hard to talk about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And also tease that as a, guess what? You're going to go beat up the people who are doing that. Yeah,
and it's a character we've had in the setting. James Sutter was the one who invented him way, way back when we were first starting out the adventure path. And he's one of the best writers I've ever had the just joy to work with. He's just so creative. And one of his superpowers is the ability to write an NPC whose goals and plots and motivations make it almost impossible to give them an alignment. And so he and I just had arguments over like, he's lawful neutral, he's lawful good, he's lawful evil. And it just went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that was one of the big challenges I wanted to do here is that I wanted to present a gold dragon that basically, for whatever reason, had fallen from goodness and was going evil. And in fact, by the time we get to this adventure path, he's evil. He's not like Asmodeus level evil, but he's still doing some shady ideas, and it gives the player characters a chance to interact with a monster that isn't normally set up as an antagonist. Usually, the gold dragons are not even on screen because they're lawful good, and if you put them in the game, they help your player characters overcome the challenge, and it makes it not fun, and you know, so it's tricky. So when we first started talking about Age of Ashes, we had this element of like, we also knew Dayhawk was involved in all of that, but he's more of the mustache twirling I'm the god of evil gods of evil. And, that's fine, but there's not a lot of, layers that you can delve into there. But it makes it a good sort of deflection at the early times. It's like, well, this is the adventure path where you deal with Dayhawk's plots for the world, but we don't really talk about... Dayhawk is kind of like the gun, and Mccurry is the guy that like found the gun and doesn't really know exactly what happens when you pull the trigger, but he's going to do it.
Yeah. And it's very easy to say, just as a company, when we can say, you're going to face an evil dragon at the end of it.
Yep.
And not be a little coy about saying, well, maybe it's referring to Dayhawk that we've been talking about this whole time, but actually it's also talking about Mccurry and stuff. So.
And it's a character that a lot of the long-term readers and stuff have known about him and asking about forever. And when we started talking about it like PaizoCon and Gen Con and online and stuff like that, we were being very coy about it. It's like who it is, all of that. Is somebody you've heard from before? Is this and the title of the adventure is Broken Promises, and we started dropping more and more clues, and it just staggered me. No one ever actually came out and asked me. I was prepared at PaizoCon if somebody said, is Mccurry the main bad guy? I was going to say yeah. But nobody did, so I dodged that bullet, I guess.
Feels like people were thinking it, but never outright stated that.
It's like they didn't think that we were going to do it or whatever. But anyway, so that was the main idea of the whole adventure path, was to basically explore what an adventure path where a gold dragon being the main bad guy would be about. And when I was picking out, again, we wrote all of these before the rules were done. So I really wanted to have all of our writers be in-house so that we'd have access to the rules before anybody else could, which is important. When I was going around asking, how was it that you ended up writing this one? Was it?
I remember exactly. Yeah. So I was in the midst of finishing up my adventure path for Tyrant's Grasp, which was the 5th part of that AP, and I knew that if I took on anything, I'd love to take on Age of Ashes, but I wouldn't have the capacity to take on something earlier on where it might be easier for me to, make an easier adventure with lower level rules and stuff like that. So I specifically asked, can I have the last part of the AP? That way I have more time to finish up my other stuff and then turn around and work on this. And you know what? I think it was for the best because I actually liked a lot of what I got to do here.
Yeah, and I really love what you did with Mccurry himself. I mentioned this, I think, on the Ask James thread here and there and all that, but just the whole the way that you interact with Mccurry, he's super powerful. By the time you encounter him, you're 19th level, maybe even 20th level.
Yep.
So, but he's still he's the top tier gold dragon, so he's like level 23, 24 or thereabouts. So he's still going to be a tough fight if you just throw down and stab him, and that's certainly one solution.
Sure,
but the whole element of like how you like get in this debate with him and have to like draw upon information not only that you found in this specific adventure but throughout the entire adventure. It's a really, really cool sort of climax to the whole storyline, even before the actual climax of going into these different portals to fight Dayhawk's manifestations and all that happens.
And one of the things that I was very adamant just from the get-go personally is I didn't want this to become a slugfest through and through. Sure, we can say, hey, you're level 20, it's time to try out all the cool level 20 stuff and push you to the limit, and I can have you fight every single creature that's left in the bestiary at this point. But that's not as interesting to me as a writer, and just it wouldn't be interesting for me as a GM to run.
Right.
And I feel like I wouldn't be that interested as a player. It's a slog of just a fight after a fight after a fight, and nothing else interesting happens. So we have Dayhawk there as the final boss,
right?
To serve as the big, epic fight that you want to have. But I didn't want Mccurry to necessarily fall into that same role.
Right.
I wanted to have something more interesting. Can we talk about it? Can we convince them that, wait, what you're doing is wrong? There's got to be a better way to try to stop Dayhawk.
It feels like the perfect storyline for like a 19th, 20th level party, because you've got this gold dragon who's one of the most powerful creatures in the book. He's traditionally been one of the toughest dragon, and having to basically solve a problem that this dragon hasn't been able to solve is not something that a low-level character was going to be able to do. It's going to have to be thematically a high-level legendary hero. And it's not guaranteed that you're going to be able to solve it. I mean, you don't necessarily have to convince him he's wrong in order to continue into the last act of the adventure without fighting him either. So there's various levels of like success and ways to get up to the solutions for this going on. Yeah. It's also one thing that I really like doing is having our adventure paths end in areas that feel suitably epic, that feel like something that is there's been a buildup to it. And with Mccurry, we've been building them up behind the scenes for years and years and years. It's been teasing something going on, and to a certain extent, the last couple of adventures we did with Return of the Rune Lords and Whispering Tyrant's Grasp, those are all things that are like we've been kind of hinting that the Rune Lords are coming back, or the Tarbet Fun is going to be doing something, and it's something that I really am excited to see us able to start really doing now that we've got a decade's worth of lore built up that we can start paying off.
Yeah, not only that, but with the way second edition plays out, it's possible for us to reach the heights of 20th level in 6 parts without doing the extra effort like you did with Return of the Rune Lords to make sure, adding in the extra pages worth of material. And suddenly, when we can do that, we can also then touch on the higher level challenges that are out there.
That was one of the things that really, when we first started talking about second edition, way early on, like 4 years, I don't know how many years ago it was. It was a long time ago. But one of the things that I kept banging my shoe on the table is like, we've got to have the capacity to do all 20 levels in an Adventure Pass 96-page format. And to a certain extent, Return of the Rune Lords was kind of an experiment by me to see if we could even do it with first edition.
Sure.
And we barely made it because I had to keep canceling back matter stuff to make room for these giant adventures. We essentially had to kind of make a 7th volume squeezed into the first 6. But yeah, with the way that the experience points system works in second edition. It works, I think, pretty well. I wasn't sure it was going to until it actually played out, but yeah,
I even got to see like how well it was working because I was slated to do an 18th to 20th level adventure, and based on my estimations when I was writing it, you hit 20th level by the third part.
Yeah.
And then you still have the entire third part, or even if you were short from previous adventures and stuff, you, in theory, would have caught up by then. So you have plenty of time to still play around 20th level stuff, even in the midst of that last section of the adventure. So yeah, it looks like it's going to be great. And
cool.
With that. Speaking of high level stuff, it also comes with a lot of challenges. I mean, it's the very first time for second edition, and for a lot of people, it's going to be their very first AP. So that we are touching on anything beyond 16th, 17th level. And I get to be the first one to present that.
Yay!
And be the one that writes that first adventure that everyone gets to play. Much like with Rise of the Rune Lords, everyone's played that now here with second edition. Hopefully, so many people are going to be jumping in with Age of Ashes. And that brings no pressure whatsoever.
None. It's easy.
But also brings, it brings lots of challenges with the way the game is designed. Something like the Bestiary is kind of focused more towards the earlier half of players' careers. So when I'm looking through the Bestiary to find, okay, what do I put in for an encounter? I find dragon after dragon after dragon after dragon, which is kind of a tough sell for me. I don't want this to become suddenly you're fighting 20 different dragons.
Yeah.
So it took a bit of work to come up with things like the Dragonstorm creatures that are here and taking variant stat blocks and things like that. And adding in a couple of extra things like putting out a fire. Or helping out the people of Breach Hill to grant us those bonus XP or the story awards for that.
Another challenge too is just the nature of this adventure. It's not set in like the world's most haunted tower or the demi-plane of deadly evils. It's set in the city of promise, which we've already said is like this is pretty close to a utopia achieved through nefarious means. But it's still a place where there's not a lot of crime. There's not a lot of conflict. The whole kind of element is like it's run by this dragon with these awful ideologues or not. You know what I mean? And but you can't just go through and kill everyone.
Yeah, the people there are still good. I mean, Mccurry himself isn't, but a lot of them believe in what they're doing here, and they believe it's good, or at least to the benefit of humanity as a whole. So it's kind of a tough thing to.
You can't just like you can't really throw devils and demons in here because there's nobody in the adventure in the site really that is going to want to summon devils and they're going to summon angels, they're going to summon things like that, and that just makes it weirdly more complicated. I think you did a really great job finding ways, not only with I think because that was always the biggest. I knew I wanted to have this last adventure take place in Promise and have a conflict with Mccurry, but I was really stumped myself as to how to get actual fights and conflicts in there, aside from the potential of just fighting Mccurry. And your solution of having this kind of nested demi-plane within a demi-plane inside of the Idara network was, I think, it was a brilliant solution because not only did it let you bring in different types of monsters all over the place, from Spawn of Rovagug to devils to like undead dragons to all sorts just all sorts of things. It also gave us this I've always loved this whole element of like, here's what happens to your world if you mess up. And I did a little bit of that in Return of the Rune Lords, but this one shows like, here's what happens if, Breach Hill gets burned down or all this other types of thing.
That's the third section of the adventure, which was initially inspired by the likes of like Mega Man. Actually, more than anything, I like the idea of the boss rush, where right before you get to the big final bad guy of everything, you kind of have to face a lot of tough challenges along the way. And then in the likes of Mega Man, you fight all the bosses from beforehand. I didn't want to just do that, but this was a perfect time to actually call back to so much that's come up in the AP so far.
Right.
So what I did is, here's the Alcetta's ring, here's Ayadara, the different Ayadara gates, and because of the way they're connected, you're kind of seeing them from the inside,
right?
And they point to the different locations you've been to so far throughout the AP. And I got to do things like, oh, well, here's one gate that points back to Katapesh, but also is kind of looking back not only at, hey, remember Katapesh, but also the history of previous APs and stuff, where it brings back Zotani, the Fire Bleeder from Legacy of Fire, or the one that points to Kintargo and is seated right in the demiplane that you visit is right in front of Castle Kintargo, and pointing to both, hey, the location you've been to before, but previous APs and fun stuff like that.
And not only that, but it gives you a chance to look at Mccurry's actual past and stuff like that. There's not really, since we didn't want to expose Mccurry as the main bad guy until very late in the adventure path, like you learn about the fact that Mccurry is involved in this at the end of the previous adventure. And so you don't have a chance throughout the first 17 levels of your character's career to start looking into his history or something like that. He's off screen. And having stuff in here, like you get to fight a manifestation of this ancient wizard that controlled him through the Orb of Gold Dragonkind Ilgreth, and looking at like
his childhood
and all of these things where you get to uncover why he is the way he is. It's really interesting. We put a lot of work into all of the significant NPCs we put into an adventure path, in part because we want them to be interesting for the GM to read, but in part because we never know which NPC might end up being weirdly important in anyone's game, you know? They might be the random person that's like, they got reduced to 1 hit point and they drop their sword and say, please don't kill me. And the player characters might decide to spare them. It happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then having all of that information about their backstory and their history and their motivations and all that suddenly is super important.
Yeah, and it was also important for me to personally to show that Mccurry knew what he was doing is wrong, and doing so through this manifestation of him, his psyche, basically, in that last part, kind of lets him speak it out loud in a way that he wouldn't be able to do so for real to the people of Promise and things like that. But still say that out loud to the PCs and let them understand how this came to be, and maybe sympathize with him just a tiny bit if they feel like, you know, maybe there was a different way that this could have turned out, and it unfortunately landed like this.
There's an interesting question in there. I get the named NPCs in Promise are high level, but is everyone there high level? Would my party encounter a level 16 Baker because the folks in Promise are all just that awesome?
I never specifically gave Promise a stat block, partially because we didn't
have that
rules.
Technology yet.
And I know Linda did with her adventure. She put a stat block, but also it's hard to say. Like, people in Promise are of varying levels and ages, and there are people who are born into Promise, and you know, how does a 12-year-old factor into the overall level of the city? So instead, what I did is just suggested that there are people have achieved the pinnacle of, you know, whatever it might be, baking or combat or whatever, and might have the capacity to do something that is far greater than anyone might ever know, but still might be like a 5th level fighter. Like, it's a fighter that's perfected their particular technique and is equivalent to a 20th level feat or something. Yeah,
it's something that we knew that the game was going to support and to be able to support. It's not until the Game Mastery Guide that it really starts getting into those rules, which isn't even out yet. But you could... The fact that you build NPCs as NPCs and not as player characters allows us to do something like there's a 5th level baker whose profession baker or profession skill is +8, but when making cakes, it's +48. We can do that. That's perfectly fine. And then that might be, as a 5th level baker, a 4th or a 5th level challenge if you just run up and stab them. But if you get in a bake off, that's a 20th level challenge. And the rules allow you to do that in 2nd edition, so that you don't have to have the commoner be 20th level in order to make a 20th level cake. It just might be their kind of thing. My personal take on Promise is that no, not everyone there is high level. It's its own kind of city. It's a very unique city. The guards, of course, are powerful because
at least the guards you'd have to deal with. The most elite guard in the entire city, and in addition to that, probably the most well-trained guards in almost anywhere in Galarian at this point.
Yeah, but the ones that are just down there, guarding the streets, they're probably 5th level, 7th level, just like anywhere else. They just don't factor into the story that faces the player characters as that plays out in the adventure itself. So it's as far as city stat blocks go, at this point, a city stat block, the level of a city only really says that the amount of work
stuff you can buy.
That's not just stuff that you can buy, but also jobs that you can take using profession or something like that. You could have a level 20 city where nobody in town is necessarily. That doesn't mean everybody in town is level 20. That just means that city is so important and sprawling and has so much history and
connections,
gravity to social, economic, whatever, that it's more important than one that's just a smaller town. So
it basically breaks down to, does someone know someone that can sell you the right thing or teach you the right thing or pay you the amount of money you need for whatever job?
There's a question for you.
Yeah, so question here from Carboned Metric. I was hoping you could talk about something that you really wanted to put in the AP book that there just wasn't room for and had to cut for space or thematic reasons. So I think I put in everything that I wanted to, but you never know as a developer just what ends up fitting on the page until it comes time to put it onto the page. So I think I had a bit more information on how the big castle attack happened at the beginning that kind of played into the different mechanics for, if you've upgraded the Citadel earlier, here's some of the buffs it gives you. But I mean that ate up so much word count that I can understand it. If
part of the reason a lot of that got cut was that the rules that you were working with when you were writing that section,
that too,
did have a more robust section of castles had the walls had this sort of stuff going on, and that ended up we didn't have room for that.
Yeah,
and so there was not really the structure to support that. So it got kind of marginalized in that way. But
that and the other thing is something that changed based on how the Alcetta's the final section of the adventure. I kind of explained more about how the demiplane worked, which didn't really need it that much to know how to go do these fights. You don't need to know the passage of time too much. It just kind of is free to let you do as you see fit. But in terms of getting stuff in, I think I got everything in that I wanted. There are a few things that I would have loved to expand on more for Promise, but part of the nature of this adventure means I have to, based on the art order, make sure there's a fight at the beginning where the castle is attacked, or the Citadel is attacked, and then also have a point where you go face Dayhawk and deal with all of that, which meant there wasn't as much space for time in Promise as I would have liked, which is fine. I think Promise you could probably be there for an entire AP volume, if not 2 or 3, just doing stuff left and right. So there were just things from the history of Hermea and stuff that I wanted to kind of tie in some way or another, but couldn't do so without suddenly having to expand on it a much more and eat into the word count for other things. There's a mention in the Lostomens World Guide that Mccurry hired I think there were 2 brine dragons to serve as guardians for the entire island. And I mentioned them again in the article later that says they're still there, but I don't have time to also bring them in and then have them fight you and then also go do all the other stuff without suddenly losing some of the content from the other 2 sections.
What challenges do you face when making dungeons for a high-level party?
Oh, boy. So just like with first edition, it's almost impossible to know by this level what a party is capable of. There are some obvious milestones where, once you get to 4th level spells, you can fly, and there's things like invisibility and the likes. And some of the spells that were more of a problem for adventure design have become uncommon spells or rare spells. So it's not too bad to come up with that stuff. But at this point, you're going to be 19th level when you're doing what's essentially the last dungeon crawl through the Citadel or through the Council Hall in Promise, and I didn't want to have to explain, well, if your PCs have this is what happens, and then if they have this is what happens, and go through the entire spell list and explain every big dramatic spell that can change things. Here's what Pass Wall does. Here's what Stone Shape does. Here's what Greater Invisibility does. Here's what, and so on and so forth. And then just lose all that word count.
Right.
So I'm a big fan of putting sandboxes out there and giving you, as a GM, the basic details you need to kind of go and have a basic idea of how things might play out, and then have enough tools to then work with depending on what challenges or what changes the PCs introduce once they're finally in there. So if your group is very good at sneaking around, the adventure kind of tells you this is where the guards are, this is where the rooms are, and they can sneak. Great. Right. Or if they want to fight, here's how many guards they're going to be dealing with and how many people or stuff like that, where it's easy enough to present the situation and let the GM kind of work from their perspective and their particular group's perspective, like how this might play out.
One thing that I do a lot when I'm either designing a higher level adventure or even making an adventure outline, you have to keep track of the level of the party. And for low level adventures, you're going to be able to use the adventure, the dungeon map itself, as sort of an outline as for how the plot is going to unfold, because people aren't going to be able to get through locked doors. They're not going to be able to, they're going to have to follow the path correctly. For higher level stuff, I often build the adventures rather than the dungeon goal being the last room at the end of the dungeon. I have there be 6 goals. You have to go here, 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 here. Like you got to go to these 6 different locations, kind of like how yours, you have to go to these 6 different zones inside of the Iodara network to accomplish something that allows you to even start the last encounter. Yeah. And often what I'll do is I'll set up the last encounter to be something that if your party decides to go right there and do it, you could do that, but that encounter is going to be so overwhelmingly powerful that you're just going to get crushed. And if you've gone through the other areas beforehand and started to whittle away at the defenses and everything, it's going to work a lot better. Castle Scarwall in Curse of the Crimson Throne is my favorite example of this, where it's not just, it's a huge castle that you can go anywhere you want, but if you just go right to the end boss, it's going to be a mess. Anyway,
another question here from Pharaohs. Are you specifically asking me, are you a fan of the Magus, and is that why you slipped Spell Strike into this volume of the AP? I am a fan of the Magus. I like the class quite a bit, but I also wanted to show that the world hasn't significantly changed with the new edition. There are still people that have the capacity to do the same abilities that you're used to seeing in first edition. We want to make sure that this world is still the same world, and the best way to show that is by showing some of these abilities off again. So I came up with a perspective way to do the spell strike ability in second edition. Whether or not that we ever do a Magus again and the design team chooses to follow that example, we'll see. But it still is the kind of, when you use it at the table, if people are used to seeing the Magus and how that works, they can then see he's a Magus, he's doing spell strike stuff. It's kind of weird because he's not using arcane magic, he's using divine magic, but hey, it's a new edition. It's also its promise. There might be people
he's super powerful.
There might be people who figured out how to do that, and we don't know that yet because it hasn't gone out of the city. So it was just a callback to first edition stuff, and we're doing that here and there. We're bringing back magic items and feats and stuff like that when we can to kind of bring the world. Just make sure the world still kind of feels familiar the way it did before.
I think we actually have a question up here that ties into one of the earlier map turners you had turned over.
Yes, actually, I was about to bring that up.
Guy up.
So right here, there's a comment about the callback to the Book 1 Town Hall Fire. It says, do you have any bonus tips for Citadel reconstruction, NPCs interact with the Dragonstorm event? So first off, the Town Hall Fire was a fun thing that Amanda got to put into her first adventure, and part of my deciding of what to even put into the first part of this adventure here was to figure out how this big dragon attack from Dayhawk would happen on your citadel, and I figured it wouldn't make sense if your citadel was the only thing that got attacked. Dayhawk is pure evil. He would probably go for Beach Hill. So I got to come up with this map on the screen here. It's on the right side, which is kind of the town hall again, but more zoomed in from what the city map showed previously in the first adventure. It's now at a much more workable scale. I mean, it's still 10 feet per square, but suddenly it's a place where you can fight. And it was just kind of fun to look at that existing map and then kind of blow it up on my paper and make that something I could draw, which is something that I don't think we would normally have the benefit of being able to do so, because being at Paizo means I can kind of see the maps in progress and steal those and use them for my adventure as well. So yeah, that was a fun bit. As for any bonus tips, I think the final basic rules of the downtime for improving the citadel and stuff have things like reinforcing your walls and creating like an infirmary and things like that.
I think the big tip that I would say would be, and this is part of the reason why I ended up having all the castle construction and all that stuff kind of happen in the background. It's like, really, if your group is into building up your castle, you're going to know. If they're not, they're going to still be able to play through all 6 adventures, and it's not going to really change the way it works that much. So by the time you get to Broken Promises, you will have organically built up a cast of supporting characters that your players and their player characters, have befriended or have formed alliances with or rivalries with. So my tip would be, when you are getting ready to start running the first part of Broken Promises, is to look at all of the NPCs that your players have, formed relationships with, good or bad, and plug them in, like swap them out for people that are stuck in fires or causing trouble or something like that, and make sure that those NPCs are the ones that play key roles in needing to be rescued or needing to be talked down or something like that. That way, rather than the encounter basically be you tell the player characters the water towers are collapsing, if instead you say, your good friend Bryn Taith is in the water tower and it's on fire, then suddenly that's something the player characters have invested their whole personality in, and they want to help. So
then we don't know how your citadel ended up. It could be that GMs took the few rules we had there and ran with them and created more and more stuff, and you ended up with ballistas and catapult and all this stuff. So, I mean, that's a very easy thing as a GM to do, something like, if you're in the middle of a fight at the Citadel and your guards are helping you out, you might get a bonus to attack rolls or damage rolls, because that's the extra attacks that are kind of being fired in from the guards and stuff. Or stronger defenses means it's harder for enemies to hit you, and you get like a bonus to AC or things like that. Little things like that, I think, are the best way to represent that. Or even just if you happen to roll an attack and it's a critical miss, you might say, it missed because of that new tower you built, and it bounces off that tower and stuff like that.
There's an interesting question. It's sort of a meta question that I'd like to bring in here from the chat. How do you feel about how deadly traps should be at high-level player play? I've noticed something of a drop-off of their use in Adventure Pass in the last few years. Can you talk about how you approach non-combat hazards and the role you want them to fill? So back when we were first doing Adventure Pass using the 3.5 rules, those rules supported traps up to level 10, up to CR 10. And the design philosophy there was that traps are basically, they happen and then they're done, and they're binary. If you find them and dismantle them, they don't do anything. If you don't find them, there's no way to stop them. They automatically hurt you. And so the design philosophy there was that they're not fun once you get above level 10. So there was not really even much support for traps. And so then when we built off of those rules and made Pathfinder, we were frustrated by the limitation. And so in first edition Pathfinder, of course, traps, like monsters or anything else, go all the way up to level 20. But things like hazards, like green slimes or like cave-ins or something like that, didn't have that format that they use for traps. So it was, at the same point, we expanded traps. We didn't really expand how hazards work. And it really kind of made for a difficult way to incorporate them into an adventure, especially with a case where it's like, if you have a trap in the adventure and nobody has disabled device, it's just frustrating for the entire party. And if it's one person has disabled device, then it makes that suddenly not a non-issue. So it's a tricky sort of thing to include. With second edition, having traps be a type of hazard and having all hazards be things that we have stats for, whether or not it's, the pit trap or the green slime or the poison mushroom air or the dragon storm, we have a format to create either the simple fire and forget traps or things that are more complicated and keep going round after round after round, like how haunts work. And so I think you're going to, first of all, be seeing more of those show up in adventure paths going forward because they're more viable use. But the fact that we didn't have really room in the core rulebook to explore how they're made, and those rules for building traps and hazards do exist in the Game Master Guide. Now that that's available to us and pretty soon to everybody else, you're going to be seeing those things show up more often. And I think that that's a really interesting way to explore encounter setups, because you could do a hazard. I could see, if you're in a 15th level dungeon and you have an encounter with like a powerful fey creature, but then you want to have like an encounter where you have like 1,000 pixies sitting in a room shooting arrows at you or something like that. Running that battle on its own is awful, but setting it up as a 15th level hazard where the number of arrows hitting you doing a certain amount of damage and being just pummeled by sleep effects make it a higher DC. There's a lot more room to do stuff like that, I think, going forward. But it's something that is more heavily supported in Game Master Guide. So there's sort of a delay before it gets into print, I guess.
And from my perspective as an author, writer, adventure writer, I am more interested in traps and hazards when they either are telling stories or contribute to encounters. It's very easy to just say you're walking down the hall, a thing launches a spear at you, you take some damage. Okay, well, I healed that up. Let's keep moving. It just is a small hurdle. It doesn't do much. But something like the Dragon Storm, where it's contributing as part of your combats, suddenly you have to deal with, bolts of lightning and tornadoes getting thrown at you. It's more meaningful. Or you can do something like a haunt. I have a haunt that I featured in the Ayadara in the little antechamber between the ring and Promise, which is that first map. Peyton, if you want to bring that map back up, it's the way station. That's what it is. For Vengegate, there's a bit there where there was a cleric who died and in the process, became a haunt that haunts this place, and getting to kind of tell a fun little story about, here's what happens to a cleric of Calistria and how their vengeance can live on through the form of a haunt, and means that even something like Vengegate, which has probably been the most well protected of all the way stations so far, can still have dangers in it. Yeah. Stuff like that.
That's one thing I really, really love about haunts. I mean, even back when we first did them in the second adventure for Rise of the Runelords, the whole point of a haunt is not only to hit the party with a new type of challenge to face, but a method of giving out backstory to the dungeon. If you go into a room and there's a bunch of goblins and they're eating giant beetles and they look a little dizzy, you just fight them and all that. But you may not know the fact that they are eating these poison beetles because the kobolds have stolen all their food and all of that stuff. You can do that with a monster encounter to build in sort of this backstory that you can then research and investigate. It's harder to do that with like a spear trap.
Yeah.
But when you start getting into more complex stuff like haunts and or more like dragon storms and stuff like that, they start telling stories in and of themselves, and that's really, really interesting to me. So
while we got these maps up, I want to talk about them just a little bit. One fun thing I did with the Waystation map is try to replicate the holy symbol of Calistria, how it has the three daggers pointing in three directions, and this is essentially a temple to Calistria that is shaped in the same way. So that was a fun little thing here. But Peyton, if we want to move on to the next map while we get a chance to talk about them. So we have Mccurry's lair with its giant treasure hoard, which was a fun thing to do here. I think the very first really big treasure hoard I encountered was part of the treasure hoard in the second to last adventure of Age of Worms, which has, I think,
That's
runs
Dragotha's?
like Dragotha's and it runs like 2 pages long or something.
Yeah, I that was an adventure that I wrote for the penultimate volume, and when I got to that treasure, Dragotha was one of the major. He's like super famous, and his treasure should still feel super famous, and then it's the same case here where you want the treasure to be something that not only is this adventure one where you're not doing a lot of fighting people and taking their stuff, but there's this treasure that belongs to what is possibly not a bad dragon that you make friends with. And so you want to make it memorable. You want to, if you get to Mccurry's treasure hoard and it's not something that takes over a page to talk about, it's not worth it.
Yeah. And I got to have a lot of fun with that, coming up with like the tool set that like sings songs while it's helping you out, and coming up with the different types of statuettes, and seeing that in the history of the different adventure paths, just how much fun it is to just come up with, here's a portrait of one of the grand emperors of Taldor and stuff, and just coming up with all this stuff and throwing it all at the wall and just seeing, well, there's not going to be too many opportunities to buy stuff with all this gold anyway. Let's just throw as much out there as possible to kind of also reward the PCs. They have been traveling around for so long and maybe haven't had a chance to buy that much, and suddenly getting all this treasure, which might include the likes of, just the perfect weapon they were finally waiting for, and runes and stuff like that.
One of the things I really like about how you set this encounter up is it's reversed. Normally in a dragon adventure, you get to the treasure at the end after you kill the dragon. And due to the fact that you're kind of coming in through the back door, and Mccurry doesn't even really realize what's going on necessarily. He's got a clue, of course, because he's smart, but you come in through the back door and get to his treasure, there's nothing guarding it because he's doing stuff. And so it sets up this really fascinating kind of test of character for your characters, where there's this treasure, take what you want. There's a couple of, traps, and I don't even think there's any traps in this area.
No, there's there happens to be guards out front, but you're coming in from the back door.
Yeah, so and at that point, it's like, you could take everything in here. Or you could take just one thing, but depending upon what you do with it helps later on when you meet Mccurry, because he's a dragon. He'll just like, you took 4 gold pieces from my stash. And you're like, oh, sorry, sir. Yeah. But it's just I love how it plays with the convention about that, And honestly, knowing the way a lot of player characters react to, GMs presenting things for them, I think that saying there's a stash, a giant page, there's a huge pile of treasure that takes an entire page almost to detail sitting on the ground in front of you. What do? I think a lot of groups are going to be like, I don't touch it.
Yeah.
It's cursed. It's haunted. Something's going on.
Yeah. And then in the development, that's when you tied that into the big debate with Mccurry. It's like, if you've taken his treasure, I think that was just a great addition to that.
Yeah.
That's what developers do, is take what's in and add more to it and make it better.
Yeah, it's a very collaborative process doing that type of stuff.
One of the things here about this map is that this is actually one of the last maps I created, even though it is the second map or so in the adventure, partially because, I knew I wanted to have a lair that you go visit Mccurry's lair and see what that might look like. But I also didn't know what that would look like until I did the maps a bit later on, where you get to visit his childhood den and realized, Mccurry probably has a particular way he likes to keep his room. He probably still does that even now, 2,000 years later or whatever it is.
Yeah. So like you see how his room is set up here with this little garden and his little maps and all that stuff. And then when you get to, it's a really cool way to just get backstory in there by showing, not telling, which is, they drill that into your head when you study in creative writing.
Yep.
It's really, really a fun way to go about it.
As we continue our trek through Promise, if we go on to the next map, we get to see what then got broken up into a few smaller maps. But the first off is that the Golden Citadel, which is a thing that got depicted. At the time, we didn't know this is what it was, but it was depicted in the Lost or the Inner Sea World Guide, where there's the Steaming Sea entry has Mccurry sitting what looks like in like the Parthenon, just kind of hanging around like a cat almost, just laying down while people are here to, assumingly have court with him and stuff. And I wanted to make sure that building was represented in at least the Promise article. We needed to know where that was, because obviously there's a picture of him sitting at it. And I came up with the idea that it's probably overlooking the entire city. And in the Promise article, it's pretty much the biggest building there, which based on that scale that I turned in for the map for the city, meant that when you actually measure it out, it's about 1,000 feet
across,
which meant I had to suddenly make sure that when I wanted to use that as part of the adventure later on, I had to make sure that the scale was such that it made sense then when you compare the two maps, which is why this map has a 20-foot scale.
But it's also, I mean, this is where a dragon lives.
It's a dragon,
He's going to want big...
He needs space.
Yeah, he's got wings.
That's why he has 80-foot wide doors, so he can open them up and walk through just fine.
And it also, it helps to build like just the grandeur of the thing. You're like 19th level at this point. If you're going through a building with 80-foot tall doors, that feels high level.
Yeah. And it also plays into the idea of creating that sandbox where I can put in a lot of rooms here and say, here's what they all are. Mm-hmm. Figure out how you're going to make it. You know, once you're going through the adventure, you know that you might want to get through to one of the basement doors that lead to the other sections, which are these two rooms on the right here. One is a secret prison that most people don't know about, which is tying into the idea that like maybe not everyone in Promise succeeds, and but that would be a blemish upon the city. Let's throw them into this prison.
But it's mean to kill them. It's not so mean to like just hide them in your basement and feed them gruel for the rest of their lives.
Exactly.
That's fine.
Yeah, that's totally within my own morality of like,
it's legal because I make the laws.
Yeah, perfect. And then there's also the kind of big archive down below, which was just a fun little attempt for me to be like, you're 19th level, but you know what? Sometimes dungeons are still very cramped. You still have to go down into 5-foot wide corridors and deal with all that. And you might not have ways to, or you might have ways now to deal with that much easier, but kind of calling back to an adventurer's life is kind of always stuck with running through a dungeon here and there.
It's interesting too, because you look at like something like that, when you mention it, there are certain things that when you're low level you can't deal with, like water or narrow hallways or stuff like that, heavy doors and stuff that at high level everybody says no, they're just non-events. That's not always the case. It's important, I think, to put those things in there for two reasons. One, if you put in some sort of like a narrow hallway or a underwater section and the party goes through it and it's not an issue, that makes them feel like they become more powerful because they think back, it's like, remember we couldn't open doors at all? Now we just push it down.
Yeah.
But one thing that comes to my mind, it was a game that Sean Reynolds was running for us like 8, 9, 10 years ago or whatever. It was a high level. We were all playing drow characters and it was in the Underdark and we were all we were like, 14th level. And there was a section of caves that were flooded and nobody in the party could breathe water. Nobody could even swim because we just had never taken any ranks in swim. And suddenly we were 14th level, but we were kind of stumped by the fact that we had to like swim through this cave. And it was a really sort of interesting choice that Sean made to give us that challenge where it's like he knew that we had the ability, if we'd woken up, we could have prepared water breathing and stuff like that, but we didn't. And so it was just a interesting way to keep people on their toes, I guess is what I'm saying. So, you get to this point here where it's like, you're 19th level, but suddenly you're having to navigate this really tight corners and stuff like that. Don't forget what you learned, I guess.
Yeah. We got a question here. Was a modified anima invocation inspired by the spirit bomb from DBZ? That's a fun thing. Real quick, the anima invocation is basically the big, powerful ritual that, if used correctly, could harm Dayhawk and let you strike at him, which the Kuja Elves used thousands of years ago during the Age of Darkness to fight him off the first time, and this is how we got to this whole AP in the first place. But that's the thing that Mccurry is trying to tap into to hopefully destroy Dayhawk once and for all. But there's a way to fix that after so many years of study on it that that Mccurry has kind of ignored because he's got kind of that tunnel vision of I've been working on Promise for so long, I'm going to do that. But the PCs can help figure that out where it's like, there's a way to tap into kind of like that spiritual energy that will let you strike at an avatar of a god and win, which I think was kind of a back and forth that we had during the outlining process. We mentioned that there might be a something or other kind of MacGuffin-y ritual that we use to fight Dayhawk. And in my initial outline for this, I put forth the idea that, what happened to the Akuje, and it's a big disaster, was they had to sacrifice themselves to power up this ritual. And that I think you took with that and decided, oh, that's probably what Mccurry's doing here in Promise, and kind of did a back and forth. I understand the parallels to the Spirit Bomb. I don't think that ever came up.
No, I'm not a Dragon Ball Z fan, so it's not something that played into my head, but it's definitely it's hardly a new idea to use the power of your own soul to empower a something. It's just the idea there's 37 stories or 36 stories you can tell. And it's just how you tell them and the variants and all that. One of the interesting things about that whole element, though, is we knew we wanted this ritual to take place and to basically be something that the Akuje used back in the day that the player characters could then learn about and then develop their own variant on. But rituals were one of the last things that got finalized in the design of the core rules. So it was touch and go at one point where whether or not we were going to be able to even include rules for rituals in the game and all in the adventure. So we had to, in the first couple of volumes, we had to kind of be a little bit coy about what exactly it was, how it worked and all. By the time we got to this one, even though when you were writing it back a few months before that, we're still working with maybe they work, maybe they don't, or whatever. By the time this was actually being developed, we did have those finalized rules and we were able to basically do something with them.
Cool. Let's move on to our next map, second to last. There's so many maps.
Yeah.
So this was, I think the most fun I had making the maps here was this section particularly. These are Alcetta's landings and the different nodes that you can go to, which got rearranged in the final version just on page because I realized, I drew these in the wrong order actually. But yeah, it was a fun thing, was just imagining what a RPG boss rush looks like without making it just like, in Mega Man, you show up into a chamber and you go into the different things that you can run into, and that takes you to the next boss fight, and then you come back and you keep doing it back and forth. But it's not as easy in an RPG where you have to give people the chance to rest and recover spells, recover hit points and stuff like that. So I came up with first the idea that the one of the gates that got destroyed in Alcetta's Ring probably got represented in the map itself, which is where Alcetta's Landing there in the top left has that kind of big destroyed area that kind of sticks out, but now has a cool building that you can hang out in. It's your safe spot. Then I got to think about, based on how this works, it's, kind of echoes of ideas and events that happened previously on Galarian, what might show up here. And tying into that, I got to bring Candelaron into the adventure, an elf that's probably been he's at least been long gone for a long time here, may even be dead at this point, who knows, but you can speak to him in a sense by having like this kind of ghost echo of a version of him that hangs out here and you get to meet, which was another thing I wanted to make sure is we bring up these themes and ideas, and one of the things is, hey, who built the first Ayadara gates? It's this important elf. Well, you get to finally learn about him a little bit more here. Yeah,
it gives us an actual chance to illustrate him for the first time and stuff like that. So,
and then just kind of playing into the idea of previous APs, previous encounters that might have been a fun thing. The Jewel Gate node where we fight Ilgrith was actually your idea. You're like, oh, is there a chance that we can encounter him because he's tied to Mccurry's past, and that was the perfect spot to put him in because it was tied to the Five Kings Mountains with that particular node and stuff, and it let me come up with the fun idea of, there's a fake imaginary wizard that's part of this demiplane that is so intrigued at the idea that he's part of the demiplane, he's willing to try to leave to investigate it more, and then the process disappears because he's left his
place, the only place he can exist.
Yeah, so just fun stuff like that that also lets me come up with things that aren't just a straight up fight. So
that's one general bit of advice I can also give out, just looking back at all the time I've been running adventures. Now and then, if you have a super just giant boss fight at the end of a campaign or near the end of the campaign where it's like a huge powerful character, and the player characters happen to just one-shot them, like just through luck or critical hits or just by talking them out of reality, like you just said, that makes actually something more memorable than a big fight can happen. So
it also gives a bit of breathing room between probably the last big fight you had and the upcoming final fight that you're going to have here. So it's fun. And one of the other fun things I got to do here was tying into existing maps even. In the bottom left corner, we have a map of Zotani's lair that was basically a modified version of the map that got put into the last part of Legacy of Fire, which was actually the very first AP I ever ran. Nice. So I have lots of it's very near and dear to my heart, and I thought it'd be fun to bring in Zotani back, seeing that I knew that he was going to show up as part of the back matter. Hey, let's use him. I'm excited to put him in, and then I imagine what would happen if he woke up. How would it be changed? So if you compare that part of the map to the map of the big pale mountain map in the last part of Legacy of Fire, you should see that the map looks similar, but also looks like as if it's been destroyed a bit more, and the lava flows far more freely because Zotani is here 3 times over.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I just love. The fact that this is sort of a kind of a holodeck fight, you know what I mean? Yeah. Where it's like you're having this what if battle. You can fight 3 Zotanis, and that also helps to make it one of the ways we can make something feel like high levels. Like, remember the boss from, well, it goes back to like the video game thing. You fought one boss, and now you have to fight a bunch of them to get to the actual boss. Yeah.
We have another question. How difficult did you find revealing campaign backstory and lore through the natural flow of the adventure? Well, personally, I had a bit of a challenge because I am here to wrap things up. So I got to make sure as much as I can to kind of tie off any loose ends and things like that. So we had the benefit of things like the archive beneath the Citadel that's like, oh, well, if you're looking around here, you might find the last tidbits of information you need to kind of fill in any gaps and stuff like that.
One thing that I often do in adventure when I'm developing an adventure path is I'll make sure that there's an NPC or a library or some sort of, vision something or other in one of the last adventures where they are basically a repository of lore and backstory and stuff like that, and specifically say to the GM in the text is like, if your player characters have any unanswered questions, use this character or this trap or this vision to reveal, to tell them what's going on. It's because we don't know what parts of the game, your party may have become particularly interested in or never figured out.
And that's actually a thing I've done a lot as a GM in my home games. In the last big treasure stasher, so I always throw in, regardless of what campaign I'm running, an item I called like the Mirror of Eternal Knowledge or something like that. And it's just this cool mirror that you can go into it, you look in front of it, ask it any question you want, and kind of answer anything that's left over on the campaign. Like, oh, what was this person doing, or what happened to that guy? And also, I then treat my players to ask me one secret, super duper ridiculous question, like, hey, what happened to Nex or whatever? And that in my home game, I explain, well, in my version of the campaign setting, here's what happened, and kind of give a fun little, you've made it to the end, let's unlock one secret for the world.
Yeah. I think that's a really great thing to throw in at the because when you get to the last encounter of the campaign or something like that, you can give them like 7 axes of the Dwarfish Lords, and it's not going to matter because they're not going to be playing the character anymore. But if you throw in a treasure that's like, this is the chance for you to learn something about the campaign, not only is it something that the players can value after doing all of this, fighting and exploring, but it feels like the type of thing that you would have to go through in an entire adventure path to get to. Yeah.
So we have a few more minutes here, but Koguru makes a mention of liking the Mccurry encounter. Says it's beautifully written. The final Dayhawk encounter map is so iconic. So if we want to look at this last map here real quick, looking through like the information on Dayhawk, I found that his realm is the Adamantine
the Adamantine
Morass. Yeah. So I wanted to kind of replicate that, which is what the manifestation of Dayhawk would be doing, is living in essentially what he knows as his home, but kind of rebuilt here in the Ayadara. So it's kind of hard to design a big dragon fight that isn't just out in the open. So I wanted to make sure there's a big area that had plenty of space to fight, but wasn't so free that, the manifestation could just fly away and then shoot its fire breath forever, and you would lose. But it would still have some kind of advantage. So I added these tunnels where it can fly from one end and come out at any other tunnel to kind of show that it has full control of this realm.
Yeah, it's a really simple map, but it's also an incredibly important map because it's the final encounter of the entire thing. And I like the idea that on the real Dayhawk is in the Adamantine Morass, and it's an entire realm. Yeah. And this version of Dayhawk is it's kind of pitiful because he's got his realm is, it fits on half a page. Yeah. And it's one square is even 5 feet.
Yep.
It's not that big.
So
this whole map would fit like inside of Mccurry's throne room.
Yeah, probably. You could fit it in the Citadel most likely. Yeah, that's all the maps here.
Yeah.
Few more things. We have a question that I don't know if we want to address.
Which one? How difficult?
No, the second to last one here, right below that.
Any chance for a 3-part adventure pass for 2 second edition, given how apparently successful it has been for Starfinder? We do a 3-part adventure pass for Starfinder now and then. Part of the reason we did that was to get more adventures out there more quickly. It's an experiment. It's possible. We might be doing that at some point. Let us know, like on our message boards or conventions and something like that, if that's something you're interested in. It's something I've always been kind of intrigued by, not only for, getting more adventure paths in, but one of the things about an adventure path that I've always leaned on is when you start an adventure path, what happened before the adventure path doesn't use rules. You could say the adventure path begins with the player characters press ganged onto a pirate ship or shipwrecked on an island or having fallen into a hole underneath the city after the demons attack. And you don't have to worry about the player character saying, well, actually, I would not have been press ganged into a pirate because I have this ability to dodge press gangs, or I wouldn't have fallen into the pit because I can feather fall, or this, that, or the other thing. If it happens before the adventure path, it happens before the adventure begins, you have a lot more room to set up really cool storylines and stuff like that. Starting an adventure path as a 3-part adventure path, I mean, even if you kind of derailing from there into something that maybe starts at like 5th level or 10th level or something like that, but doesn't go for the entire adventure path, it opens up some interesting ideas. It's possible.
Never say never.
Yeah, never say never, for sure.
Yeah. So, got the last few minutes, I wanted to bring up what I think was something that was very important to me, which is part of that Mccurry encounter, was the sidebar, or I guess kind of a sidebar that just says, you can play this out without having to roll dice. You're at the very end, or what feels like the very end, and you had to make this big dramatic debate, come out in your favor. And it's entirely possible that you in character give this rousing speech, and you might even be role-playing it at the table, give this rousing speech that will obviously change anyone's mind, and then roll a 2, and that just doesn't feel great. Yeah. So I wanted to make sure it was important. It was important to me for GMs to realize and know and understand that it's okay if you don't want to use the rules for this section and just kind of move ahead with how role-playing works, or if you want to congratulate or reward the good role playing and ideas that your players have, and kind of give you that license to do that as you will. So I think that was part of the reason why I think the Mccurry debate turned out as well as it did.
Yeah, cool. There's one other thing real quick on the topic of 3-part adventures or 2-part or 4 adventure paths. One thing that you can do if the problem is that you don't have time to do an entire 6-part story, a lot of the times when we do adventure paths, and this is something that I often do, is I try to build in points where you could stop early. Like Iron Gods is formatted as a trilogy. You can do books 1 and 2 as its own adventure path, its own story, and not do anything else.
And Hell's Rebels at the end of part 4.
Hell's Rebels very, very easily ends at part 4. That's when you could play Hell's Rebels as a 4-part adventure path and not even touch the last 2, and it works pretty fine.
Legacy of Fire could literally end after the first one if you're just fine with taking over Kelmarain.
Yeah, just because something is a 6-part adventure doesn't mean you have to play it as a 6-part adventure. We are pretty much out of time now. So thank you again for writing a rad adventure. If you are interested more in world lore, I mentioned this in the previous hour. We've got a Humble Bundle going on for another 16 days. It's really focusing on the world lore. And you can pick up a lot of PDFs of various products, like the Sandpoint book that I wrote. There's all sorts of stuff in there that you can pick up. And a lot of the world lore hasn't changed with edition changes, so you can still, deep dive into it. And maybe think of that as homework, because in a week from now, we're going to be is it a week? Next Friday? We're doing
next Friday, the 20th.
It's going to be you and me? Or?
Sure, I'll hop in if you'll have me.
Yeah, basically a free for all, like whatever you want to ask about the world, we'll answer questions for hours at 4 o'clock or something like that.
If there's no questions, we'll just kind of rave about the stuff we like.
Yeah. So. Maybe we'll accidentally give out a secret that we're not supposed to be talking about. Like, we wouldn't do that.
No,
we're well trained.
So. Yeah, we're good.
Yeah.
We never make mistakes here.
Never.
Ever.
Nope. Cool. Well, thank you, everybody. I guess what do we got coming up? Is it coming up next, Peyton? Or
I think Dragons and Things will be.
Dragons and Things are coming up?
Dragons and Things is doing a thing.
They've recently been got in the studio, so they've been kind of iffy right now.
Ah, well, we'll stick around.
Them anyway, they're fantastic.
Yeah.
Second edition soon. So
Cool. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you.
Have fun making friends with that wonderful philanthropic dragon. Yeah, or stab him.
Yeah, we'll see.
Cool.
Bye, everybody.
See you guys later.